Hello and welcome. Today we would study Integrating Disability, Transforming Feminist Theory, and this is an essay done by Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. Now, this essay calls for a disability-oriented, inclusive feminism, and this is actually a part of many of the syllabus which are about feminist studies, women's writings. And if you're interested in disability studies and you also have interest in feminism or gender studies, this essay would actually help you develop your thought about these two areas. Now, in this video, I talk about the essay and I explain some of the arguments which are made by Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. I also understand that since this is an essay recommended for students from undergraduate studies, it may be slightly difficult for some students. So I do urge that you should be trying to at least read the essay yourself. And if there's a problem, you can actually write in the comments and you can ask questions if there's something that you do not understand. And in this video, I will take a few quotations from the text and discuss them with other examples and some visual aid. So for this video, most points that Garland-Thomson has mentioned are discussed. All points, however, are not discussed. So you should actually read the full essay. Now let me begin talking about the essay. Now, she introduces the essay and says that disability studies and feminist studies are actually two forms of identity studies. And she says, and I quote, "Even though disability studies is now flourishing in disciplines such as history, literature, religion, theatre, and philosophy in precisely the same way as feminist studies did 25 years ago, many of its practitioners do not recognize that disability studies is part of its larger undertaking that can be called identity studies." So clearly she says there's an overlap between gender studies and disability studies, because one, they are both identity studies, forms of identity studies, and also more importantly, the same questions are being asked by people who are doing disability studies and the feminist studies scholars who've been fighting for similar, if not the same, biases. Okay, and just like feminist studies, when feminist studies came, we started looking at different fields of research, like history. We started looking at history again. We started looking at culture again. We looked at theatre, philosophy. All these studies basically changed when we got a better understanding of gender. But the same has not happened for disability studies as of now. Okay, and she says again, and I quote, "The most sophisticated and nuanced analysis of disability, in my view, come from scholars conversant with feminist theory, and the most compelling and complex analysis of gender intersectionality takes into consideration what I call ability-disability system, along with race, ethnicity, sexuality, and class," unquote. This is what she says in page 257. Now, I would first introduce what intersectionality means. The word intersectionality means that the way different issues, different areas of your personality, different aspects of your personality intersect with each other, right? So to put simply, intersectionality includes the multiple factors that may affect the advantages and disadvantages that you may have because of different aspects of your identity. So these factors would include gender, caste, sex, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, disability, and also physical appearance. So to give you a clearer picture, I would say that your privilege or your power or your agency depends on the way you are perceived by society, the conventional ways in which you are perceived by the society. And so for instance, if you may have more agency if you're able-bodied, upper class woman, rather than a woman or a man with disability and who is from marginalized race or an ethnic background. So the fact that your gender, your race interact with each other in order to establish the kind of power you have in society, that is called intersectionality. And she says that she recognizes that identity studies are often thought of as non-serious and too narrow and also reductive. And she says, I quote, "Nevertheless, feminist theory is still resisted for exactly the same reasons that scholars might resist disability studies. The assumption that it is narrow, particular, and has little to do with mainstream of academic practice." So she says that many people believe that feminist studies doesn't do much to take a discourse ahead, right? And this idea is actually an obstacle. And she says, feminist theory, despite the fact that it has been, around for ages now, it still does not include disability. And it is often assumed that if you start doing disability activism in addition to fighting for rights of gender, you would be relegated to a corner and no one would take you seriously as an academic. But this is an assumption that one needs to get rid of if you have to do genuine study for disability studies. And she goes on to say, and I quote, "Just as feminism has expanded the lexicon of what we imagine as womanly, has sought to understand and destigmatize what we call the subject position of women, so has disability studies examined the identity disability in the service of integrating disabled people more fully into our society," unquote. And she says that she recognizes the value of language and the change in the lexicon brought by gender studies. And this is to just also highlight that language, the addition of language or the expansion of lexicon, or having a vocabulary to be able to address an issue that you may have been facing, it's not just a cosmetic. Language is not just a cosmetic issue. When you have the language, or you have the lexicon, or you have the vocabulary to address issues that affect you, you become more empowered, right? For instance, children who are often abused, they don't even know how to express themselves, how to tell others what they are going through, mainly because they don't have the lexicon, mainly because they don't have the vocabulary to describe their issues. And when we talk about the idea of lexicon in a wider area, she says that both feminist studies and disability studies have expanded the lexicon and have enabled us to talk about various issues. And she says that with the help of feminist studies, we have now been able to understand different genders better, right? There is better integration of people who may be transsexual or who may have different sexuality. And this is all with the help of gender studies. Similarly, with the help of disability studies, we have now been able to understand to a great extent the fact that people have different degrees of ability, right? And therefore disability studies has enabled us to talk about various issues. And to explain this further, I'll give you another example. We now do not have separate schools, at least in Indian cities, for instance. We do not have separate schools for children with visual impairment or for students with hearing impairment. The idea is that these students should actually study in the same institutions with other children with no disabilities or with no impairments. And similarly, there's a better talk about mental health conditions of children and adults, right? So this lexicon of disability has actually helped us reduce the stigma around people with disabilities, right? So she says that just like feminist studies, disability studies has given us this lexicon or the language or the vocabulary to talk about these issues and therefore be able to integrate disability in society and to destigmatize disability. And she brings here an important point. She says, and I quote, "A feminist disability theory builds on the strengths of both feminism and disability activism." And she goes on to say, and I quote, "I am not proposing yet another discrete feminism, but suggesting instead some ways of that thinking about disability transforms feminist theory. And she says considering disability shifts the conceptual framework to strengthen our understanding of how these multiple systems intertwine, redefine, and mutually constitute one another, unquote. So she says that she's not really proposing a new kind of feminism, and this focus on disability will not dilute the focus of feminism from, say, race or ethnicity, but it would enable us to have a richer understanding of the body itself. And this change in thinking will enrich feminist theory, because feminist theory also concerns the body. Actually, the patriarchal world operates on the basis of this difference of the body, or what you may call the bodily difference is called corporeal difference, right? So she goes on to say, and this is an important key point that she makes, and I quote, "The informing premise of feminist disability theory is that disability, like femaleness, is not a natural state of corporeal inferiority, inadequacy, excess, or a stroke of misfortune. Rather, disability is a culturally fabricated narrative of the body similar to what we understand as fictions of race and gender," unquote. And she says here the word corporeal inferiority means bodily inferiority, right? So she says that feminists argue that women aren't innately inferior. The society is formed in such a way that women have had to take a secondary status. They are not innately, their bodies are actually not innately inferior. It's a social perception. Similarly, disability does not make somebody innately inferior. It does not mark a hierarchy, it's just a marker of difference. The hierarchy is actually created by social structures, okay? Which body is, to explain it to you further, if you have a perception of which body is better than and which body is inferior, that is not generated by disability per se. It is because of mindsets, because it is influenced by social structures and your social perceptions of bodies, right? So I'll give you another example in this regard. Imagine a child who limps in a poor village in a developing country like India, okay? A child who has some kind of disability with his limbs, okay? And in a developing country, such a child, especially if he's living in a village, he or she typically would not be able to complete his or her studies, not because of the limp per se. The limb would not give him any kind of learning disabilities. It will not hamper his cognitive ability, but because the limp actually make the school inaccessible to him. So because of the inaccessibility of the school and the lack of resources, and this is a scenario which is very, very rampant, very common in India. And in such cases, the social resources, the mindset is mainly responsible for issues of disability. Disability by itself is not responsible for people's inability to achieve anything in life, okay? And so this is a very important point that not only that is being made by Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, but it is a point which is made by most disability theorists and most disability activists, that what makes disability which disables people is not the disability per se, it's not an impairment per se, but the way this impairment affects your accessibility of the various resources that may be available in your country or in your society. And now, with this outline about why we need feminist disability theory, and how disability and gender studies overlap, she gives you 4 different kinds of critical inquiry which you should be doing to understand this area better. And these domains which she highlights are representation, the body, identity, and activism. I would be dealing with all these 4 issues in my next video. Thank you for actually suggesting me to do this video. I'm a little late in uploading it. It was initially requested by a few subscribers of mine, Ishika, Shefali, and Amjad. Thank you, all 3 of you. Thank you for requesting for this video. I hope I'm able to do some justice to the theory of disability and feminist studies made by Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. I'll continue with the same areas in my next video.